All right, so thank you for the great introduction and for having me here today. So the goal of this talk is to first provide an in-depth introduction on knowledge graphs, because this introduction will sort of form the foundation and the basis for how we've built the tools that Paul mentioned. And then if there's time, I have a couple of examples at the end that we could go through that really show how we've used them to do interesting things with OHDSI and OMOP data specifically. So just an important disclosure now that I'm working more in an industry environment. So the work in this talk was primarily conducted during my PhD at the University of Colorado and as a part of a postdoc at Columbia. And this work was funded by 2 training grants awarded by the National Library of Medicine. And any opinions, findings, or conclusions that are expressed in this talk and any associated materials are mine and do not reflect the views of my current employer. Okay, on to the fun stuff. So this slide provides a brief overview of my talk, which will begin with an in-depth introduction to knowledge graphs. And this portion of the talk is really designed to dive into graph fundamentals, introduce semantic web as we use it for these tools, and to provide some examples of how large-scale knowledge graphs can be queried. And then we'll end with a discussion on the use of linked open data within these frameworks. The next section of the talk will discuss knowledge-based biomedical data science. And during this section, I'll introduce 2 publicly available tools that we've been developing: PheKnowLator, which is software designed to construct large-scale biomedical knowledge graphs, and OMOP2OBO, which is software designed to enable alignment between OMOP standard vocabulary concepts and the open biological and biomedical foundry ontologies, or OBO. And finally, if time permits, I have some examples of how we've used these tools for computational phenotyping. And if you've seen a recent presentation, this might be familiar to you, but I've tried to also capture some information that I haven't presented recently in this area. Okay, so let's jump right in with our first topic, which is Introduction to Knowledge Graphs and Graph Fundamentals. So a graph can be thought of as a collection of discrete entities and the set of interactions between them, where entities are nodes, and these are sometimes referred to as sites or actors, and interactions are the edges or links between them, which are also referred to as bonds or ties. And any system that can be composed of identifiable nodes and definable links can be modeled and analyzed as a graph. So building a graph requires at minimum the ability to answer 2 questions. The first being, what's a node or a vertex? And the answer to this question defines the set of discrete entities or objects among which edges exist. And the second question then is, well, what's an edge? And the answer to that defines the set of pairwise interactions in the graph between any given 2 sets of nodes. And how these questions are answered then shapes the kind of descriptive, predictive, or causal questions that we can then ask about the underlying system that we've represented with this graph. This slide provides different examples of graphs for 3 different domains, where each graph has a specific area that it's focused on, and it's defined by specific sets of nodes and edges. So for example, a metabolic network could contain metabolites connected by metabolic reactions, and a protein interaction network could contain different types of proteins, which are then connected by interactions or bonds. And these examples illustrate that for any specific system that you're interested in representing, the fundamental questions can be answered in multiple ways, producing different kinds of graph representations of a single idea within that domain. So really knowing what the entities are that you're representing and how you wish to represent them is the most important part of building a graph. And ideally, knowing how to do all of that is derived from the type of, or knowing how to do that is derived from the type of question that you're intending to use the graph to answer. But let's dive into more specific representations or how we can put graphs together. So mathematically, we define a graph G, where V is the set of vertexes or nodes, and E is the set of edges, and each edge then represents a pair of nodes, I and J, which are elements of V, so that set of nodes. And this slide is really meant to illustrate some important low-level graph concepts. So the graph on the left illustrates a simple, undirected graph that contains 6 nodes. whereas the graph on the right represents a directed multigraph with 6 nodes, with the number 5 node being weighted. That's why it appears larger than the others. It also contains self-loops, or an edge that connects one node to itself. So that's node number 2. And similarly, it contains a multi-edge, represented as 2 edges between nodes 4 and 6. And this solidifies sort of what we were talking about on the prior slide, where there are many ways to represent the same information in the graph. So both of these graphs contain the same nodes and almost the same number of edges, but the way that we connect things in our graph lets us do different kinds of downstream tasks on that graph. So diving a little deeper into those 2 types of graphs, a simple graph like the one that was on the left in the prior slide contains undirected edges. So these are edges with no arrows, no implied directionality, no self-loops, and no multi-edges. And there's oftentimes no node or edge attributes, so no labels or descriptions associated with edges or nodes. In contrast, a multigraph, like the one that was shown on the right, contains undirected edges, can contain multi-edges and self-loops, and can contain node and edge attributes, again, things like labels or even weights. The most basic kind of network is called a simple graph, and it has the following properties. So edges are undirected, where a connection between 2 nodes I and j implies a connection j and I. So there's no directionality. You can say I is connected to j or j is connected to I. Edges are unweighted, so edges can either be present or absent. There's only this binary relation. We can't say anything else about them. And there are no self-loops and no annotations on the nodes, except that nodes are uniquely indexed. So we can, at any given time, query the sets of nodes and always get back the same one if we know its index. Edge attributes can be information that are stored on the edges of a graph. So things, annotations like these can be arbitrary complicated, extending a whole vector of attributes or just a list of simple tags. So they could be things like the label of the edge, a color associated with the edge, or something larger about the network, which implies some sort of category. If they're weighted, it's usually presented as a scalar value, which could represent an interaction or the frequency of one or the strength of it. They can be signed, and this can represent things like inhibition or activation in a biological system. So it's bringing this additional layer of context to tell us what an edge actually means, not just that 2 things are connected, but how they might be connected. And then they can be temporal, so a discrete point in time at which any edge exists, and each group of co-occurring edges imply a similar relationship between time. So the attributes we place on a node or an edge sort of extend what we can say about a network beyond just that these things exist and that they're connected in certain ways. Node attributes really are thought more as metadata. So there's less you can do with a node attribute than you can with an edge attribute. So they're primarily restricted to things like categorical variables or labels, and they can imply state somewhat, and also can be used for spatial coordinates. So if the position of a node has meaning in your graph, you can use a node attribute to indicate that as well. So again, edge and node attributes can really be thought of as additional context applied to a base representation that we can use for other types of analyses beyond just knowing what's connected and how it's connected. So going beyond a simple graph to a multigraph, and multigraphs are really what are used in most of the OBO foundry ontologies and most of the semantic web-based structures. These types of objects relax restrictions against repeated connections, so we can have multi-edges and self-loops. They also imply that there can be, when there's 2 edges between the same nodes, they can mean different things. So they could be necessarily directed, they could not be, they could be one of each. And that's important for providing additional context and flexibility. And so one type of way we can think of a multigraph, or what's represented using one in a simple circumstance, are roadmaps or driving maps can really be thought of as multigraphs, where each town is represented by a node, and an edge connects 2 nodes if there's a road between them. And so self-loops in this way can be thought of as one-way streets or or in some sense, a cul-de-sac. So moving on to directed graphs. So these are graphs where arrows appear on the edges, and this is really almost always used to specify specific directionality or causation, if you will. And if edges are asymmetric, we call them directed, meaning that unlike in a simple graph where an edge implied I and J and I, when we're in a directed graph, an edge can only occur between I and J if it's independent of J and I. So they're not reversible in that sense. And a directed graph is thought to be acyclic if it contains no cycles. That is, for every possible edge between I and J, there exists a path between them. And if that is the case, then there's no path between J and I. So again, you go one way through the graph, not the other, when we're talking about them being directed. So now that you have a quick and dirty feel for different kinds of graphs, and this isn't every single graph, but those were the most commonly used ones, we can start talking more about advanced structures that are built off of graph logic. So things like knowledge bases and knowledge graphs. And most knowledge graphs, because you need the flexibility with the semantics you represent using them, are modeled as a directed graph, and in this case, a directed multigraph. So a knowledge base can really be thought of, and you'll hear many different ways of defining this in the literature, but the way that I was taught and the way I think about them are a collection of assertions or facts that we can query, create, and share. And a knowledge graph then is this graph-based data structure that represents a variety of heterogeneous entities, multiple types of relationships between them, and can serve as this abstract framework for inferring new knowledge. We can also use it to address a variety of applications and use cases, again, depending on what we put in the graph and how we model the relationships between those things. Building graphs and knowledge graphs really requires the ability to access lots of different types of information. The World Wide Web was invented by Tim Berners-Lee to enable this rapid sharing of information between scientists all over the world. And within this paradigm, machines are thought of as these constant brokers for storing, organizing, requesting, sending and receiving, and displaying different information. But these lines between users and publishers get blurred, and this causes challenges when we think about what the semantic web is. So initially, it created problems around content that was created for specific websites, which was then really difficult to standardize, exchange, and share. There were also challenges with licensing and technical issues, which caused fragmentation between what people would like to share and what they can actually share. And it further places limitations on how the data can be altered once it's shared and what it could be used for. And finally, it limited reusability because of the prior challenges, which also caused people to start then replicating or reproducing their own resources to get around the hurdles caused by these things. So why is this important? It's because this is what really motivated the semantic web. So the goal of it being to address these challenges by making the web's content machine readable so it can be reused for any purpose, ideally, and automatically combined or integrated with other machine readable content in order to enable machines to automatically do stuff with it. So this was the grand goal. And this might seem, well, why are you showing me this? Well, I'm now going to talk about how the semantic web laid out this framework for everything that we've built knowledge graphs on top of. And it's a really fundamental set of ideas which has supported the way that we've built these tools and how we've built them. So jumping right in. So the semantic web standards are often thought of as the semantic web layer cake, which are shown on this slide. So at the bottom of the cake, you have characters. So the use of Unicode character set maps to store binary streams of information and convert it into textual content. You also have identifiers, which are globally agreed upon, so things like uniform resource identifiers or URIs. At the second layer, you have syntaxes with formally defined grammars, so things like XML, JSON, and Turtle. Built on top of syntax, you have syntax identifiers and characters, you have a data model. In this case, which can be thought of as this generic model to provide a canonical representation for content, irrespective of the domain or the syntax, to enable processing using standard off-the-shelf technologies. And the data model used in the semantic web is called Resource Description Framework, or RDF, which we'll dive in a bit deeper in a few slides. So the importance of a data model is really to enable querying and rule sets. So content needs to be processed by querying and rule-based systems to extract relevant elements, to infer new data, and to specify specific constraints for tools. And the semantic web query language, which is also called Sparkle, works with this sort of framework. So it's important for Sparkle to make these assumptions. Also built on the data model are what we're all very familiar with, schema and ontologies. So these are formal languages that provide a meta vocabulary with really well-defined semantics that can be used and hopefully easily combined with the data model. So examples include things like RDFS or RDF schema and the web ontology language. And we'll also jump a little bit deeper into these in a few slides. So assuming that you've built your cake properly, it allows you to unify logic. So it's this works as this interoperability layer that provides the foundation for combining lower level technologies with this unifying language to engage queries and rules over your knowledge base. And by having unifying logic, it enables you to establish proof or to derive evidence that can be used by a system to validate a procedure or task. So that's why these things are all building on each other. If you could make assumptions about unifying logic against specific querying rules and a data model, then you have a higher confidence in the answer that you get back from that system. And this relates to trust. So again, having better proof gives you more trust in what you get back in terms of determining the source of your proof and whether the data and content that you got back are actually what you intended them to be. And so the very final layer, which I think is important to talk about, but it's less meaningful for this talk, is cryptography, or techniques that we use to verify the identity across control mechanisms. And again, this all works with trust, proof, and logic. And I like to think of these things as being the frosting of the cake that interact with the cake itself, which is the syntax, the data model, the ontologies, and the querying rules. So all of this being the foundation of standards, models, and pieces that you need to start building knowledge bases in a way where you can reason over them and have high confidence in what your reasoner will return. So I'd now like to dive a little bit deeper into semantic web standards, since the two tools we'll talk about later are very fundamentally rooted in these. And they are the foundation of most semantically expressive modern knowledge graphs and ontologies. So the Resource Description Framework, or RDF, is the core data model of the semantic web. Just some important things that will come into play later. So it does not adopt unique name assumptions to avoid bijective mapping to reference. And this just means, so a bijective function is a one-to-one correspondence or invertible function between elements of two sets, where each element of one set is paired with exactly one of the other. This is an important concept for how we derive relations between elements in our graph. Important elements that will also come up later. So three of the most important things that exist in RDF are these universal resource identifiers, so unique concept identifiers that tell you where that resource is coming from. Literals, so these are lexical values, which can either be plain or typed. So plain could be a text, which will carry a signatory to tell you the language. It could also be an integer, which we apply a schema to tell us that what this string is. In this case, that 2 is an integer. And then finally, blank nodes are very fundamental, and we'll dive into some examples of what these are, but we can think of these as existential variables. So they're things that denote the existence of a resource without having to explicitly reference it or define it with a URI. And these are really, really fundamental to how OWL is created and how we connect logic in that sense. So I'll show you a picture of what that means in a few slides. But before we get there, another fundamental aspect of RDF are triples. So these are edges in semantic rich knowledge graph structures. So they're used to make statements about things. And there's always 3 arguments in them. So an RDF triple always has a subject, which is an RDF term. So it's either a URI or a blank node that refers to the primary resource being described by this edge or triple. The predicate is the relationship between the subject and the thing that it's pointing to, which is the object. And the object fills the value of the relation. So a subject is some entity that we're referring to. A predicate tells us its relationship to the object that it points to. So an example on the slide, that a lemon is part of the genus citrus. So this slide provides an illustration of what a blank node actually is and how it's used to model logic and relations between entities. So blank nodes in RDF graphs are really used to represent values that are known to exist, but whose identity remains unknown. So in the figure shown on the slide, they represent specific steps that are involved in making lemonade. So you can really think of a blank node as being a pointer to an entity that enables it to be used in an assertion or a statement without having to explicitly define it each time it's used. So it's a sort of a logical placeholder that enables us to represent complex facts without having to fundamentally define them. Building on top of RDF is RDFS. And RDFS is another important standard of the semantic web. And semantics of RDF are ideally standardized in the form of a model theory, where these RDF triples are seen as making claims about the world. And formalizing claims about the world requires us to evaluate the consistency of them, to be able to produce their necessary entailments, which I'll describe in a second, and then to understand the truth about them according to the theory that's applied to the structure. So given an RDF graph containing various claims that are held as true, things like entailments formalize other claims that as a consequence of our representation must also be true. And this is a really powerful way to build really expressive knowledge automatically without having to necessarily know ahead of time all the claims that have to be true given one fact. And I'll show you what I mean by that because it probably sounds kind of weird, but it's very important. Important to know the limitations of RDF. So RDF does not make machines more aware of the real world, and they do not try to capture the full intended of the thing that they're representing. It's more of a concrete scaffolding, if you will, for how to connect logic. But going back to entailment, so the importance of entailment again is if you create a knowledge representation and you want to be able to quickly index and do inference over it, you need, in this case, to know all the paths through the graph. And one way we can do that to build on a base representation and fill in all of those paths is through entailments. So this slide provides an example of what an entailment looks like. The first figure I'm showing you models an example of different triples about books and asserts the following facts. So it tells us that book 1 publishes MIT Press. MIT Press is a type of publication. Book 2 is also a type of publication. And book 3 is an article, and an article is a type of publication. So when we use entailments for free, we get all of these things that are now shown in red in addition to our base model. So without having to explicitly define them. So for example, since book 1 publishes MIT Press, which is a type of publication, we can directly infer that book 1 itself is also a type of publication. And entailment is a huge benefit of using RDF and RDFS because, again, we don't have to know and specify all possible assertions in the graph, and we can use a reasoner to give us this additional knowledge that's necessarily true for free. So the RDFS, just going back to that, builds on RDF vocabulary by attaching semantics to it. So it extends it in 4 key ways. It adds RDF subclass of, which allows for stating that the extension of one class and its set of members is necessarily contained within the extension of another. It adds RDF subproperty, so similar to the RDF subclass of. It allows for stating that all things related to a given property or relation are necessarily related by another property. It adds this idea of a domain, so we can state that a subject of a relation with a given property is a member of a certain class. So this allows us to organize sets of subjects under one kind of label. And then finally, it adds range. So it analogously allows for stating that the object of a relation within a property is a member of a class. And again, these are all powerful tools for letting us capture what we know to be true, given a simpler set of facts. So why should we care about entailment? And again, I'll give you one more example, which shows how it works when you add RDFS onto an RDF graph. So RDFS really takes it a step further because of those 4 extensions that I just reviewed. So this figure on the slide gives some simple logic for how we define a machine-readable definition for what a lemon is. Using RDF, we can infer that a lemon is both a type of species and an owl thing because its genus has the domain species and its species is a subclass of owl thing. Similarly, we can infer that a flowering plant is a subclass of eukaryote because it's a subclass of plant, which is also a subclass of eukaryote. Again, the point here is to set up some initial base logic correctly, just that the schema and syntax used to instantiate it enables additional insight and logic for free. Sorry. RDF vocabulary and semantics only go so far, though, even with entailment. And luckily, there are 2 other features of the semantic web that we have access to, like ontologies and description logic, which extend this further. So ontologies within the semantic web are built on the web ontology language, or OWL, which if you remember Winnie the Pooh, you might be familiar with how tricky spelling was for these characters, including Owl, who accidentally misspelled his name as WOL. And so this is sort of a loose joke for how the web ontology language is now called OWL, or why it's called OWL and not WAL. So computational ontologies can then be thought of as collections of primitives relevant to a domain, often related to each other by explicit subsumption or subclass of, and meronymy or part of statements. And within the biomedical domain, ontologies like the gene ontology are really these community consensus views of the entities involved in a specific part of biology and biological research. And these are analogous to how nomenclature committees systematize naming conventions. So knowledge bases created from community-curated ontologies provide significant advantages for reproducibility in scientific research, for interoperability, and for avoiding pitfalls in how we model knowledge because of these facts. In general, you can think of ontologies as consisting of assertions that express some sort of facts about the world. For example, the protein ontology contains a class human P53. The gene ontology contains a class DNA strained renaturation. And the relation ontology contains a class that defines participation that we can use to link these entities. So you can use it to link 2 entities that participate. So putting these 3 classes together, we can make an assertion that could become part of a knowledge base, and we could say something like human P53 protein participates in DNA strand renaturation. So OWL supports RDF-based semantics. Well, what does that mean? It specifically supports this idea of direct semantics, which enables ontologies to be translated into axioms. You can think of axioms as statements that are always considered to be true. And they're compatible with formalism called description logic. And description logic aims to define a subset of first-order logic where the semantics of the language can be supported in this very correct and complete manner using reasoners. So it's a fancy way of saying we're adopting this formalism where we assume certain facts to be true no matter what. And because we assume them to be true, we can use reasoners to figure out when they are not true. So we can ask reasoners, given this big graph that I've written, can you tell me, did I consistently represent knowledge in a satisfiable way? Are my subsumption hierarchies correct? So is one class that's necessarily a subclass of another properly represented and connected? Did I correctly type the instances of my classes? And then you can perform really complex queries against these ontologies to infer new knowledge through things like entailments. So when we talk about description logic, it's really important because it's at this fundamental way for how people build knowledge graphs or even ontologies. And it makes 2 important kinds of roles, or it defines 2 important kinds of roles, which become important when we talk about modeling knowledge. So these are called the T box and the A box. The T box describes classes, so you can think of these as types of objects, properties or relationships, and assertions, so statements of facts that are assumed to generally be true. The T box is often formalized as an ontology, which consists of classes and properties that describe relationships between classes or instances of classes. So for example, in the figure, gene is a DNA sequence that is located in the cell nucleus. This is a T-box assertion. But description logic also allows for A boxes. So A boxes describe individuals. So if you think about classes as canonical knowledge, so P53, this means all P53s. But we might want to talk about a specific kind of P53 for a certain experiment we run, or how P53 relates to certain organisms. This is what we use an A box for. So an A box describes individuals or instances of classes and assertions about them that are just specific to that instance. So again, we just want to say something specific about one type of P53, not all types of P53. And the A box uses an ontology's classes and properties to model instances. So it extends what we can say. So from the prior T-box representation, we can say that endothelial receptor type B is an instance of a gene, and this particular instance of it causes ABCD syndrome. Okay, so quickly through querying rules, because this is important given that you've built your knowledge graph using these semantic web resources. There is one particular kind of language that's most commonly used in the semantic web for querying these objects, and that's called SPARQL. So the SPARQL standard specifies a query language designed specifically for RDF and a protocol by which these queries can be invoked and their results returned. So the query can consist up to 5 main parts. It has a prefix declaration, so these are URI prefixes that can be used for shortcuts later in the query. A dataset clause, so this is a closed partition of some indexed dataset over which you execute your query. The result clause, so that's the type of the query that's being executed and what result should be returned. Your query clause, so these are patterns that are matched against the data returned in your clause. And then your solution, so that allows you to modify the returned data by placing constraints around the ordering or slicing of the results. This slide shows an example of a SPARQL query run against the DiseaseNet database. This is a publicly available database, and they have a publicly available query engine. So it's designed to retrieve all genes associated with Alzheimer's disease with an association score greater than or equal to 0.4. And then example output is shown on the bottom right. So you can see different genes and their names, as well as the score that's associated between that gene and Alzheimer's. So just to give you a sense that it has a similar feel to SQL, but it's different clearly because it's written for RDF. And then the final piece that if you were putting all of the semantic web layers together, what this enables you to do is hopefully to better leverage resources like linked data. So linked data can be thought of as a set of design principles to share machine-readable interlinked data on the web. And when combined with open data, so data that can be freely used and distributed, we call this linked open data. An RDF database such as OntoText or GraphDB are examples of linked open data. And I like this image, and what it's providing you, or what it's from, is from a website called the Linked Open Data Cloud Diagram. And it shows the data sets that are published in this linked open data format and how they are related to each other. So it's a very rich, connected representation, which is nice if you're going to build a graph off of it, because you can take advantage of these existing connections and relations between the data. So why should we care about linked data? The core idea is a set of principles by which the semantic web can be effectively deployed to facilitate discovery and interoperability of data. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, early RDF data were dumped into silos, which while the data within them were interoperable, they were rarely interlinked, and they had inconsistent naming, and they were published using different conventions. So these linked principles were created as a way to help reduce this limitation and improve the usability and interconnectivity between these resources. And this might seem, if you're familiar with FAIR, that's sort of where this came from. And FAIR data, which meet the principles of findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. The acronyms were defined by a consortium of scientists building on this effort to make things more connected and more linked. and to do it in a way that really allows them to be reproducible. And to emphasize machine actionability. So this idea of allowing computational systems to easily find, access, interoperate, and reuse data with minimal human intervention. Because if you're processing big complex data, the likelihood of an individual being able to query or quality control every resource is highly unlikely, and it's hard to do that in an efficient way. Okay, so now that you've had a very quick overview of relevant semantic web concepts and this idea of the layer cake, I want to introduce what we're calling knowledge-based biomedical data science, because the idea of it is to take advantage of this complex representation to help computers understand what it means to have, what a biological mechanism means, what it means to do and think about biology. So knowledge-based biomedical data science involves the design and implementation of computer systems that act as if they knew something about medicine and biology. And there are many ways in which a system might act as if it knows something. So it could use existing knowledge to generate, rank, or evaluate hypotheses, or it could answer a natural language question about a biomedical topic. Knowledge-based systems specify a knowledge representation, so how a computer system could represent knowledge internally, and one or more inference or reasoning methods to represent output derived from them. And a knowledge representation is therefore the schema or blueprint for how we build a knowledge graph. And there are many ways to construct biomedical knowledge graphs, but nearly all of them rely on some kind of linked data, or how else are you going to be able to connect entities? So if we boil the literature down into the minimal set of different ways of doing this, we can say there's about 3 approaches for how graphs are built in the biomedical domain. So there's simple graphs. These join nodes as a series of edges. There are hybrid graphs, which join nodes as a series of edges to existing ontologies. So they're taking advantage of some existing semantics. And then there are complex graphs, which use formal semantics and with or without formal ontologies. And then the general workflow that applies pretty much across all of these approaches involves steps like downloading data, pre-processing it, which could be filtering, identifier mapping, cross-alignment between identifiers, and then you construct the graph, and then if you need, prepare different node and edge metadata. So diving into each type, simple knowledge graphs aim to model entities and their relations using basic network science representations without formal semantics. So they could have one or more node types, maybe a single directed or undirected edge, and may or may not, but usually not, have associated node or edge metadata. And so they have a very general workflow, and their output is usually just a tabular list of edges and nodes. It could be an adjacency matrix, and there may be a dictionary associated to provide labels to different identifiers. And so the table at the bottom of the slide just provides a high-level example of what nodes and edges would look like for this type of graph. HedioNet. This is an example in the wild of a simple graph. It's a network with multiple node and edge relationship types, and it was designed to encode biology. The HetNet was designed specifically for a project which aims to systematically identify why drugs work and then to predict new therapies for drugs. And at the time of writing, it had about 47,000 nodes of 11 different types and 2,200 edges, or sorry, 2.2 million edges of 24 unique types. So it's a pretty well connected graph, and this is a publicly available one. Moving from simple to hybrid graphs aim to model entities and their relations using a mix of standard network representations and some formal semantics that's usually borrowed from ontologies. So they'll also have one or more node types, but they'll be typed, so you'll know what type of node something is. Similar, they'll have a single or directed edge, but it will also be typed. And then there's usually more metadata associated with the nodes and edges. So in this case, you'll have additional labels on edges, not just on nodes, and you might have some context around what an edge means, like it could be related to where that edge was derived or how confident you should be in it. An example of a hybrid graph is the clinical knowledge graph. And the clinical knowledge graph is an open source platform designed to represent relevant experimental data, public databases in the literature, and it's constructed from over 26 databases, 6 experiments, and 9 ontologies. The final type of graph is a complex graph, which aims to model entities and their relations using formal semantics with explicit modifications to data not represented as an ontology. So it has one or more node types and multiple directed edges, and these are all specifically RDF typed, and it will have associated node and edge metadata, which are integrated to the graph structure as annotation assertions or stored as named graphs. The workflow is general, but it will have modifications to ontologize the data, so you have to do a bit more work to represent knowledge in a machine-readable way in a complex graph. And the output is usually serialized to RDF XML or turtle format. So we're getting away from the more simple tabular-based output. So this slide shows you an example of the 3 different types of graphs and how they differ when used to model one triple. In this case, they're all modeling the concept ABCD syndrome. So ABCD syndrome is an autosomal recessive syndrome characterized by albinism, Blacklock cell migration disorder of the neutrocytes of the gut, and deafness. So really what the high-level takeaway here is all 3 of these structures represent the same idea at differing levels of machine readability and expressivity. And why that matters is what you plan to do with it. If you just want to do, let's say, basic network inference, then a simple graph might be all that you need. But if your idea is to create a knowledge base, which you can then run a reasoner over and get additional concepts for free, then you might want a more complex graph. So as you saw in the prior slides, there are many ways we can build knowledge graphs. And the 3 most common ways, again, are simple, hybrid, and complex. So now I'll tell you about an open source tool we've been developing that enables you to build all of these types of graphs. So just to give you some background to quickly motivate this work, there are design and implementation challenges that just make it difficult to build a knowledge graph. The design challenges include things like there are multiple ways to model knowledge, and there are no existing benchmarks for knowledge graphs built using different data models, so it's difficult to know which approach to use. Implementation challenges include things like these methods may have varying functional, logical, and semantic consequences, and the existing methods tend to be siloed and complicated, especially when you consider that the semantic web standard is really expressive, and it's not entirely known the benefit of it when used to represent knowledge graphs if your intention is to do different kinds of downstream tasks. So we designed PheKnowLator with this in mind. And PheKnowLator stands for Phenotype Knowledge Translator. It's intended to be the semantic ecosystem for automating the fair construction of ontologically grounded knowledge graphs with fully customizable knowledge representation. And this figure just provides an overview of the ecosystem and its 3 primary components. So it has these resources to construct knowledge graphs. It has benchmarks, so you can determine from pre-built graphs this way to systematically assess the differences between different ways of building a graph for your specific downstream use case. And then it has access to cloud-based tools and other types of things you can then apply to your graphs. So PheKnowLator is capable of building 12 different versions of the same knowledge graph. And it does this by altering the knowledge model. So this is the approach that's used to convert a simple edge into a rich OWL-based representation. So this slide shows an example of what I mean by that. So there are 2 primary types of knowledge models, the A-box and T-box that we talked about, and PheKnowLator adopts those approaches. So the figure on this slide provides an example of how the knowledge models differ when used to create the triple EDNRB causes ABD syndrome. So the challenge around this is really related to what your base structure is. And in this case, EDNRB is a gene that isn't currently represented in an ontology. Luckily, ABCD syndrome is a class of the human phenotype ontology, and it is included in a knowledge graph. And why that matters is, depending on whether you use the A-box or T-box approach, you have to anchor different pieces of data that are not already ontologically grounded into an existing ontology or a set of them. And again, this depends on how you want to model your knowledge. And so the bottom part of this figure is showing if I was using an A-box model, what would it look like to create the edges in my knowledge graph necessary to represent the idea that ED-NRB causes ABCD syndrome, and how does that differ if I used a class-based or T-box approach? And you can see there's different levels and different amount of information required depending on the approach that you use. In addition to different knowledge models, PheKnowLator also provides flexibility in the representation of relationships. So there are two relation strategies: unidirectionality, so you can have a single edge like gene causes phenotype, or you can do them bidirectionally by inferring a relation's inverse. So if the relation is from something like the relation ontology, you will have the edge chemical participates in pathway, and you can infer for free from this ontology that pathway has a participant that's a chemical, so you can get both directions. But you can also do inference over implicitly symmetric relations or edge types that represent interactions like gene-gene or protein-protein interactions and infer them for free. So PheKnowLator lets you have access to any of those approaches. Finally, it also enables semantic abstraction. So you can think of this as this lossless compression algorithm that converts a rich OWL-based representation into a simple graph representation. And it adds additional sort of harmonization properties. So you can do this. So sometimes you will have an ontology that includes A-box and T-box, and maybe that's okay. But for some applications, maybe you want just one approach. So PheKnowLator also provides this harmonization, that lets the abstracted knowledge graph be cleaned so that it can be consistent with either approach. So the semantic abstraction algorithm we use is called OWLNets, which stands for Network Transformation for Statistical Learning. And it's a method that reversibly abstracts OWL into a more biologically meaningful representation. So it takes it from OWL to a simple graph that just contains your nodes of interest. And it generates semantically rich knowledge graphs that can be used for different types of tasks where you don't need OWL. So this is an example of what that might look like. So the graph on the left is modeling the drug trametinib, known drugs that interact with it, and the proteins that are targeted by it using OWL. The figure on the right is what the OWL graph looks like after we run OWLNets. And you can see after OWLNets, only the nodes and edges that are biologically meaningful are left. So in other words, OWLNets enables users to go from a complex graph to a simple one. The PheKnowLator ecosystem provides access to several months worth of pre-built knowledge graphs under the different parameter settings that I just reviewed. So the figure illustrates the knowledge representation we use to construct these benchmarks. So the idea was to make a graph that represented the mechanisms of human disease. So in this figure, the purple box represents experimental data. The blue box contains molecular mechanisms created by integrating OBO foundry ontologies. And edges between ontologies are created by integrating other data sources that are not part of an ontology. Those are in the solid black lines, whereas dashed lines represent relationships that are inferred from the relation ontology, and dotted lines represent relationships that exist between ontologies. And so the final graphs that we were able to construct from 12 OBO ontologies, 22 linked open data sets, and 2 experimental data sets gave us graphs that ranged that had about 700,000 nodes and 25 million different edges. I like this slide because it provides a high-level overview of the six different versions of the OWLNets build. So these are just the semantically abstracted builds that we can create that differ based on the knowledge representation you used. So whether you used subclass or T-box or instance or A-box, whether you did just directed relationships or undirected relationships or both. And the goal of showing it is just to demonstrate how different the builds are. So it may seem consequential, but even when you start from the same knowledge representation and the same data, you can get wildly different resulting graph structures, which will impact what you're using the graph for. Okay, last thing in the last 10 minutes, the other tool that we've developed is, so say you have a knowledge graph that's capable of representing the mechanisms of human disease. Wouldn't it be awesome if you also had a way to connect the entities in this graph to clinical concepts in an electronic health record? and specifically concepts that are normalized to the OMOP common data model. And that's what we were trying to build, and we called this OMOP2OBO. So what motivated this tool? So deep phenotyping, which has been defined as the precise and comprehensive analysis of phenotypic abnormalities in which an individual components of a phenotype are observed and described, really requires being able to synthesize a bunch of different types of patient-level data. And while common data models help solve the challenges of standardizing clinical-based vocabularies, we know that it becomes difficult. They weren't designed to help us systematically or semantically integrate all the resources that one might need for deep phenotyping, so things that are external to what we might find in EHR. OBO foundry ontologies provide these computable representations of biomedical knowledge and are designed to help us enable integration of different kinds of data related to them. And so then the challenge becomes, how do you go from your EHR concepts to the concepts that are in OBO ontologies? And as we know from prior experience, it can be a really, really significant manual curation project and can require lots of domain expertise. So our goal was to provide a tool that can assist this process. So OMOP is a system that generates mappings between standard clinical vocabularies in the OMOP common data model and the OBO foundry ontology concepts. It tries to obtain a mapping by first directly aligning concept codes and strings, and then leverages concept embeddings to match concepts using labels and synonyms, providing a score to tell you how promising that match is. If we're unable to obtain a match from any of the prior steps, it can also input manual mappings. And throughout the entire mapping process, it tracks important metadata and collects evidence that it can use to categorize the outputs of the mappings, so give you a level of confidence, but also tell you exactly how that mapping was created. And we leverage the system to map a large subset of condition occurrence, drug exposure ingredients, and measurement results. And now I'll go into what these mappings look like. So condition occurrence concepts were mapped to two OBO ontologies, the human phenotype ontology and the Mondo disease ontology, with examples shown on the screen of very simple, high confidence one-to-one mappings between these sources. Drug exposure ingredient concepts were mapped to four OBO ontologies. So chemicals were mapped to KEPI, organisms were mapped to the NCBI taxon, proteins were mapped to the protein ontology, and vaccines were mapped to the vaccine ontology. OMOP concepts were mapped only to those sets of ontologies among this list that made sense, which is nicely demonstrated by the three examples on this slide. So for example, Adisleukin is mapped to three ontology concepts. It's a human antineoplastic agent that involves the protein interleukin-2. And finally, measurement concepts were mapped by interpreting their results against a reference range, where the result is aligned to the human phenotype ontology and the constituent parts of that test are mapped to several other ontologies. So two different examples are shown on this slide. The first demonstrates what a positive and negative result for a urine test for amphetamines would look like. Here we use logic on the human phenotype ontology concept to indicate a positive or negative result, and we map urine to the Uber anatomy concept for urine and amphetamines to the KEBI ontology concept for it. So using OMOP2OBO, we built a map set, or a set of mappings for 92,367 conditions, 8,600 drug ingredients, and over 10,000 measurement results to ontology concepts that represented over 9,600 diseases, over 6,000 phenotypes, 83 anatomical entities, 2,700 organisms, 4,200 chemicals, 132 vaccines, and over 270 proteins. So a rich set of annotations. And using R and Flex Dashboard, you can interact with mappings for each of these domains and download them there if they're of interest to you. So we are currently maintaining this. And then finally, how did we evaluate the mapping? So why should you trust us, and how do we know that they're good? So we did 3 different tasks. To evaluate their accuracy, we had 10 domain experts manually review 20% of the most challenging manual mappings, and 74% of the conditions, 71% of drug ingredients, and 93% of measurements were found to be accurate. For generalizability, we, in collaboration with Anna and Patrick, and other people on this call, we were able to demonstrate the coverage of the concepts in 24 independent hospitals. And so what we found was that 99.5% of our condition mappings, 99.9% of drug ingredients, and 68% of measurement results were covered by our mapping set in those separate entities. And then finally, to look at the clinical utility, we compared OMOP2OBO mappings to a set of validated manual mappings when used to identify patients with rare genetic diseases in an AOU, an All of Us research data set. And then not only did we look at, do we capture the correct patients that we should, but we also looked at the query performance. So OMOP2OBO mappings identified 99.3% of the mappings that were identified by this validated manual set, and we did it using fewer codes and 1/3 of the querying time, which was a positive finding. So wrapping things up, and since we are short on time, I'm just going to skip to the very end of this, which we can go back and I can show you examples of how we use it later if anyone's interested. But I wanted to say that really building these resources wasn't just something that I did alone. It required the help and supervision and direction of a ton of different people from many different places. And so I want to thank them for that, and also to thank Paul for the opportunity to hopefully not bore you all too much by talking about the semantic web and these resources we've been building, and really intending for people in the community to use specifically. It would be a dream come true if anyone in the OHDSI community were interested in these tools, because we want to know how to make them better, but we also want to know how they could be useful for the types of projects you're working on. If you're interested in learning more about any of this, I can share these slides, and there are links to really good resources that go much deeper into any of these areas. And then here's some recent publications that we've had on both of these resources. And thank you so much. I promise I'm done now.
Tiffany, thank you so much, and right on time as well. That was really quite the tour de force. It's really great to see today how open science and open source work together. And we from mapping the data to building, to analyzing the data, to building artifacts, all the way to building these knowledge representations and these knowledge graphs. So it was really fun to see where this is going. And so I'm excited by this, by seeing what we can do by connecting to these other knowledge bases, and be able to really be able to create a lot more evidence. And so I'm pretty excited about the work that you're doing. And I am interested, I know Andrew put a post in, so we don't really have an active group in OHDSI on graph. There's not like a working group. And so is there a group that gets together that talks about using graph technologies? I see Andrew's got you have one within N3C.
There is. It could really benefit from much broader participation. There's a tremendous set of resources, data resources, as well as knowledge resources. People like Brian Laraway, who are doing work in rare disease, that are building on the approach that Tiffany and the groundwork that she's laid, Justin Reese, other people. And I've tried to help foster connections with the OHDSI community, but Tiffany is the person to speak about how we ought to move that forward. It's certainly deserving of much broader support and a space dedicated to it. So Tiffany, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question, and I also apologize for not being as active in that group in N3C as I wish I could, given career constraints and changes. But I think, and maybe this is an outsider way to ask the question. So a lot of people can build tools, and then you find once you build a tool that you built it because you had a specific use case in mind, but I would like to build tools that are actually helping people solve problems, and that's really hard to do alone. I have certain knowledge of certain things, but I certainly can't guess what everyone else might be wanting to use it for. So I think if there's a way to even start with a single use case that could motivate something where this could demonstrate impact, could be one particular way to start. But I mean, that would be my lean, is let's find someone who has a problem, who's open to us solving it with a knowledge graph, and see what we can do, and see if it can grow from there, maybe. I don't know if I answered your question correctly, but that was a sort of roundabout way of, I don't really know the best answer, but I'd like to try to get at solving the problem.
I think the N3C is a good space where there is OMOP data, where there are knowledge graphs, where people with the right expertise, and a lot of clinicians coming with problems to be solved. And I think connections between it and the broader OHDSI community, as well as between the translator, NIH Biomedical Data Translator Program, which is several efforts all combined into one, and a couple of which use OMOP as the representation of clinical data for work that they're doing, are significant connections that we can bring together in N3C and find the best ways to make them more known to the OHDSI community. I think this presentation was just a great way to broadcast a lot of your fantastic work, Tiffany. So more efforts like this seem like part of the issue, or would generate more understanding of what is involved and the value that can be derived from it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you for the support always, Andrew. You've been a huge part of making me feel like this work was actually worthwhile.
And Wojtek, you have a comment? We're going to have to close up soon.
Yes, I'm waiting for the unmute. Okay, yes. Tiffany, interesting talk. My quick question is, given the age of AI and the fact that AI will read the whole internet every night, I feel like I will just give it a task. Please construct the same thing as you see in open link graph, and it should do it. I think so. I'm wondering. There's the AI work group established now in OHDSI, and I wonder how this all lives in. I mean, some people say obviously it's way more important to have like things like Wikidata, but I'm not sure, because I'm thinking the curation of it and deduplication and finding all the nuances, the robots will be so much better at this. So any of your thoughts on how? I haven't seen any in your talk, and now the AI kind of appendix to this.
It's a great question. And actually, I spent part of my morning talking to Nico about this a little bit, in the sense that the large language models give us this profound ability to work with amounts of knowledge we've never been able to before, in a questionably accurate way sometimes, in a super accurate way in others. And we were talking about, so we'd like to use them to be able to automate some of these processes, because they'll definitely be able to do it. But the first question that we need to figure out how to answer is, how do we evaluate them properly? So not necessarily just using knowledge graphs as a form of RAG to evaluate large language models, but how do you use knowledge graphs with large language models and have a verifiable and high confidence way to say, oh yeah, it works really great for these kinds of knowledge, but we got to be really careful for these kinds of facts. And I think this is where a cool application within a group like OHDSI, where you're working on evidence-based things, could be an interesting avenue to go to be able to start identifying when and where does it work well, and when and where doesn't it work well, because then we can start directing our efforts to those places and using the automated functionality for the things that it does well easily and quickly. But yes, I haven't included that in my dissertation because I started building these resources before large language models were really a thing, and would like to evaluate them against it. But the benefit of that now is we have these manually validated things. We can start actually using them to validate the same kind of output we could get if we let a large language model do it.
Tiffany, would you agree that like the initial forays by people who kind of have all the right pieces in place to answer the question about the application of LLM is that it's not as promising as you might expect, that Wojtek's enthusiasm or expectation that LLMs might be the automated solution is at least premature, if not like ultimately doomed, and that there's like it's just not you don't plug it in and it just kind of pops out the other side in a reliable or even close to reliable way, and that the studies of the domains of application of LLMs haven't suggested a great benefit as in other areas where they don't seem to outperform kind of simpler or manual approaches. Would you agree roughly with that summary?
I would say that I definitely wouldn't trust it out of the box, and I'd want to put in a bunch of very serious guardrails before I let it do something other than write my my social media posts for me when you're going to apply it to, like, if you think about how many biologists it took to make one KEGG pathway, and that is like the fundamental resource we use for drug development and all kinds of things. It took hundreds sometimes of biologists working on one problem to make that accurate view of biology, and we can't even apply it to all model organisms. I think large language models could definitely help us get there faster, but not until we know how to use them safely.
Yeah, and sorry for talking so much, but I on the recent vocabulary call, I suggested that we might need a white paper that says what are the questions we think LLMs might help us with in this domain of vocabulary generation and mapping and understanding, and so that we can constrain, because there's so much enthusiasm and activity around applications, understanding the domain of application of LLMs, that we could really help make sure that's productive work by really narrowing kind of the questions and domains where we think they could particularly pay off. So if you agree with that roughly?
Yeah, I think that's very timely. I don't know if you saw the post sent out from AMIA this morning where they were advertising an article that can use LLMs to automatically draft phenotype definitions. And I thought, oh man, I really want to see what that actually looks like. I mean, maybe for some, but for others, it's probably a little terrifying or funny.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we need to add Llama to a demonstration next year to our developers conference.